Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. Oh my god, we've got to get right into it today. We've got a great show for you, and it's coming right up. First, I need to say quickly that Enterprising Individuals will be making an appearance at the Convergence Convention in the Twin Cities next weekend. That's August 5th through the 8th. I will be representing the podcast on a number of panels at the show, and Mikan Hana, who is a frequent guest on this show and the host of a few other shows on our network, will be there as well. We will also be recording a live episode of the podcast at the con, as we are wont to do. This is our fifth year running. We did not take last year off. We did, of course, a virtual panel about Star Trek Nemesis, even though the con itself was canceled. This year's subject is Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and boy, are we going to have a lot to talk about there. We're recording the episode, and we plan on publishing it later in August, but the plan is to live stream it from the con, as we have done in the past. In fact, many of the panels and programming from the con will be live streamed or available online to watch. Stick to our social media, specifically Facebook and Twitter, to see our episode when we go live. We'll be going live on Friday at 10 p.m., and you can go to convergence-com.org to get more information about the con and the programming that they provide. Because we'll be getting ready for the con next week, we do not have a regularly scheduled episode next Wednesday. It's not my preference. I do my best to have a new episode every week while we're live throughout the greater part of the year. That being said, I think that we have far exceeded that mandate for the last 2 years at least, years that featured a worldwide pandemic, a capital insurrection, and general unrest just about everywhere you look. So sorry for taking a week off, is what I'm trying to say, even though we actually will have a show that week on that Friday. So I hope you get a chance to listen to it, and I hope you enjoy it. Today I'm talking with Peter Aidan Byrne, the mind behind TrekVersusTrek.com, and I asked him a seemingly innocuous question: how has Trek changed from its inception in the 1960s to its current incarnation in 2021? He's the right guy to answer that question, as his blog, Trek vs. Trek, compares similarly themed episodes from different Trek series, and explores often that same question in comparing and contrasting episodes made in different decades and different cultural climates. It's a great discussion, and I think for me, it scratched a particular itch that I've been feeling recently about the development of Star Trek over the years and the essentially unchanged status quo that it's maintained for over 50 years. But we cover the entire enchilada over the course of our talk, and I hope you enjoy it. I've got to go. I've got a live episode to prepare for. Check back with us next week to get more information on our live episode and updates from Convergence. It's Wacky Doodle, but it's our Wacky Doodle, and with that, let's get underway. I'm joined once again on this episode by Peter Aidan Byrne. Peter is a writer and essayist on pop culture and runs TrekVersusTrek.com, where he examines the thematic and narrative similarities between episodes from two different Star Trek series. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
It's great to have you back on board, and it's been a little while since we spoke. We spoke last in 2019, and a lot has changed since then. Or at least people's awareness of existing situations, I think, has changed, from economic disparity to unequal rights to even our preparedness for a global pandemic. And I think if you were to put 2019 up against 2021, you might barely recognize that only 2 years has passed.
Yes, yeah. 2 years has never felt quite as long
Yeah,
in my lifetime.
2 years that I've experienced personally, yeah. How was your pandemic?
Oh, it was, in a lot of ways, not too bad. I'm, fortunate enough to be able to mostly work from home. So, which, again, is sort of highlights some of the weirdness of the things that have been sort of pointed out by the pandemic. But yeah, in a lot of sort of material ways, things have been not too bad, but it's been a very sort of strange time to be a person in the world. But
yeah, it certainly has. And I work from home as well, and I was always comfortable with that. I always enjoyed that. And maybe it's just that human nature of being denied something. But as soon as the sort of the pandemic stay-at-home order came in, I was like, oh no, I can't go anywhere. I can't. I realized how much I worked remotely by going to coffee shops, and just sort of ruminating on things and writing scripts and things like that. And it's just been 18 months of like, this is what I wanted, I guess. And here I am. And I'm not sure I'm so happy about it now.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's that weird sort of paradox has been present in so many ways. People have talked a lot about being, maybe feeling a bit, people who find themselves to be a bit more sort of introverted, um, finding themselves in exactly that situation. Like, this is exactly what I wanted, but now I can't do, I can't socialize when I want to socialize as much as I
Yeah.
would normally.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah, and even now, as things are, you know, like gradually moving towards quote unquote normal, it's a weird feeling too of that, like looking forward to doing things that you couldn't really do over the last couple of years, but also still, it still all feels a bit weird. I'm
Yeah.
sure that's everyone, I'm sure, is working through that in their own way, but it's, it is it's hard to know how to feel about any of that, which is no, which is understandable, I think,
Yeah,
but
how foolish we all were to want this, to just want a break. Trek has been growing by leaps and bounds just in these past few years, with new shows being announced, new seasons of existing shows. And when you sit down to write a Trek versus Trek essay, are you making a point of comparing the new Trek series to classic episodes?
Yeah, that's something that's always been, on my mind about how to approach these things. It's sometimes I regret the choice to title it Trek versus Trek,
Yeah,
which
well, yeah.
I had the very, I chose that I started Trek versus Trek very shortly before the current sort of generation of Star Trek started, before Star Trek Discovery and the Star Trek shows that came before it. And that kind of, some of the, sometimes reactions and arguments over is something Star Trek or is it not? I feel a little bit like, oh, maybe Trek versus Trek wasn't the best thing to call this,
Yeah, yeah.
I was just going for something pithy. But I do try to emphasize that comparing in terms of quality is and in terms of certainly in terms of like, is this more Star Trek than that? I'm not interested in that really. I mean, I'll complain,
Yeah,
about things just like anyone else will, but
yeah.
it all is what it is. But yeah, I certainly I try to keep things within my own experience. So I'll compare my own experience. I hope it comes off mainly that way, that I'm comparing my own experience of things. And I think that yeah, I think that the most interesting things to look at for me are where we see different perspectives among all the different versions of Trek. And sometimes there is kind of a through line of how the way the fictional universe deals with certain things has changed over time in kind of a linear way, but sometimes it's not. I don't always find it that simple. Sometimes the fictional universe seems to jump around a little bit in terms of
Mm-hmm.
not just progressing, but maybe sometimes coming back to the way that one series or another tried to approach things.
Yeah, and Trek often, I mean, there's only so many relatable plots out there, I suppose, or themes, and so Trek is often sort of revisiting those themes, and that makes a perfect sort of laboratory for you to compare these episodes. I know I have a different podcast called BackTrekking, where
Mm-hmm.
we look at comparing Trek media with the media that inspired it, which is movies, TV shows, books, sometimes real life events, and sometimes other Star Trek episodes. And when I discovered your blog, I was like, Trek versus Trek. Oh, that's such a good name. I enjoy your essays a lot. And your essays have really made me think differently about many of the episodes that I'm familiar with of Star Trek, but also the new ones as well. It's hard to remember sometimes that like most Trek is almost 30 years old or is 30 years old, and my ideas about it are so set and they're so concrete, and I've had so much time to kind of ruminate on them. And then a lot of the new like CBS shows, I've seen them once or twice, and then I've got other things to do, and I haven't reached that point in my life where I'm going back and like rewatching episodes, rewatching series, and remembering and thinking about what happens in them. And so I don't have like a set opinion so much, other than like I enjoyed it that night or I didn't enjoy it that night. But reading some of your essays where you compare Lower Decks episodes or Discovery episodes to earlier episodes has given me like a new perspective, a new positive perspective on a lot of the new CBS Trek shows.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. That is something that I definitely struggle with a little bit. I do. I want to write about the new Star Trek, partly because partly because it's something a lot of people are paying attention to. Obviously, people are interested in it, but I'm interested in it as well. And I'll watch the episodes and have ideas for what I'd like to write about. But I do feel the same way that, again, part of what before there was all this new Star Trek, that things were so, before I started writing Trek versus Trek, Discovery was on the horizon, but I had no idea that we were going to end up in basically sort of an equivalent of the 90s, for there being so much Trek running concurrently. More so, I think, right? I think at this point we're probably going to have more series running concurrently at the same time than we did in the 90s. But my experience with Star Trek, up until the sort of Discovery era, has generally been the experience of, I watched The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine as they were airing originally, but I watched the original series, as reruns, since they aired, far before I was born, and kind of came back to Voyager and Enterprise later on. And so my experience of Star Trek has always been kind of this like marinating in it, rather than, again, I was consuming the episodes, week to week for Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, but along with watching reruns of the others, and then going back to those while being introduced to Enterprise and Voyager. And so the experience of watching new Star Trek now is different than that. I do sometimes worry that I don't know that my ideas are about it are as well formed or as fair, maybe in some cases, as about the older stuff, where I've had more time to think about it, and also it sort of exists in conversation with itself, whereas the new Star Trek does too. But it's at this point it is kind of its own environment, with so many different shows running at the same time.
Yeah, well, I think you're pretty fair with the new Trek shows, or at least my opinions tend to agree with you, which is the best kind of critic to follow. Speaking of shows that you are maybe not familiar with, since we have talked about, the last time you were on the show, we talked about Twilight from Star Trek Enterprise. And since then, I've finished my first watch through all the way of Enterprise. I'd never really seen every single episode before in order. And the thing that I keep saying about it is like, I don't know what everybody's complaining about. Like, I think Enterprise is often thought of as, one of the lesser children of the family, but, there are some slightly problematic sort of elements to it. And it's definitely a step backwards, I think, in terms of, its progressiveness, but it's like a really great show. And it's a show that is, made really at the height of at least the production. Like, at this point, the Star Trek production knows how to make a Star Trek show. And I was just really impressed by, the cast and just the level of the production all the way through the series. Sure, it was cut off early, and we didn't get to see, like 7 seasons of it and maybe where they wanted it to go. But I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think I've definitely come to appreciate Enterprise a lot more than I had. And I think that, as these things go, like sort of a consensus for, or what seems to be a consensus. You go on the internet and there's a million different consensuses about the same thing, but a consensus kind of forms that, it's, just sort of a bad show all around. And I know there are a lot of people who haven't shared that view for a long time, but certainly I think that it's an interesting, flawed series, but they're all flawed in their own way, and there definitely is more like meat there, I think, than I would have given it credit for not that long ago. I think, yeah, as you said, there are certain things that, of course, certain things that I can understand why a person might bounce off the show entirely. In terms of, as you mentioned, I think that something that is immediately striking about it is the casting of it seemed almost intentionally regressive. Like, it's kind of hard not to see how the casting was like almost meant to walk back some of the choices that had been made in the Star Trek that came more immediately before it, and the portrayal of again kind of returning to the way that in the original series it was great, of course, to have Uhura and Sulu on the bridge, but how much were they really given to do? And then we kind of have the same situation where very few characters of color are given almost nothing to do in Enterprise, and the one character on the show who isn't a white man is and who also gets a lot of screen time and a lot of stories devoted to her is just objectified to a ludicrous extent sometimes. And that's the sort of thing where if someone sees that and bounces off of that, I completely understand. Other things like the theme song, like, yes, if you think it's silly, that's fine, but come on, it's kind of fun, right?
Yes.
And I do think that in some ways it's some of the most experimental Star Trek we've ever gotten. It's some of the Star Trek that has, I would say, certainly, with the exception of maybe Deep Space Nine, I don't know that any other Star Trek has kind of experimented as much with what it can do. I think part of that was sort of struggling to stay afloat, struggling to find an identity for itself. But, that's often where interesting stories come from, I think.
Yeah.
And the approaches of the highly serialized third season, and then that fascinating fourth season broken into those sort of mini movies of 2-3 episode arcs. That's something formally that Star Trek has never done before, I think, before or since. And there's a lot going on there. I have a hard time sometimes finding sort of a thematic kind of through line of like what the series as a whole is saying. But again, I think that is partly due to the fact that it was both experimenting with what it was and, was cut short in that experimentation.
Every time there is a new Star Trek series, from TNG all the way to Lower Decks, there's a section of fandom that says, this doesn't feel like Star Trek. Like, what happened to my Star Trek? And I'm just assuming here that some of those complaints are disingenuous and some are possibly honest. And if we start critiquing critique, we'll be here all day. We'll just leave that where it is. But it made me think about the way that Star Trek has changed and evolved over the years, sometimes in obvious ways, like the effects and the sets and the props, and sometimes in less obvious thematic ways, like what Star Trek chooses to show and what it chooses to say and why it makes some of those choices. Star Trek in this case means, a crew of thousands over the life of the franchise, right. Hundreds of writers, different settings, different actors, etc. Trek is bigger than any one voice, but obviously some of those voices are louder than others, specifically the individual showrunners and the executive producers of the shows. The loudest voice was Gene Roddenberry's, obviously.
Yeah, and it is, it's an unusual thing. I mean, I suppose it is a thing that happens with stories that end up turning into these big, long running fictional universes like Star Trek. But it is, we're both the people making the shows and the fans, the people enjoying it. We're all kind of in conversation with Roddenberry, even though we don't necessarily it just in of course for creative people in general, like there's what you're doing, and then there's how you present yourself, and those two things don't
Yeah.
always match up. And that's not necessarily disingenuous or anything. That's just part of how these things work.
Yeah.
But so it's kind of where sort of interpreting through an interpretation sometimes. And it is interesting to I think go back to things that are kind of most presumably most directly show some of Roddenberry's original influence, and kind of see what has kind of stayed with Star Trek, even long after that. And I think in general, sort of I think he, I don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but among, the things he was interested in, I do think that, the idea of sort of like, what does it mean to be human? I think
Yeah.
that that's as broad as that is. I think that you can find that in all Star Trek going forward. Granted, you can probably find that in all science fiction going forward,
Yeah.
maybe to some extent. But.
And certainly, like any legend, the idea of Gene's vision for Star Trek has become legendary at this point. There's a more sort of mundane core to it. I've said before that I think it's funny that, for this show and this franchise, which has really become, the gold standard for diversity and for progressiveness in sci-fi, it was started by this white guy, this Irish white guy, who like fought in World War II and was a television executive in the 1950s and 60s. You'd expect it'd be great if we got some like Angela Davis type, to like create this amazing progressive thing for us, but we got this guy instead. And the original pitch doc for Star Trek says nothing about a United Earth government or the lack of scarcity or money in the future or an evolved sexuality. It mostly just promises that it's a space show for adults. This is a good idea, and we can save a lot of money by having every other planet look a lot like Earth.
Right.
And, the closest the pitch doc gets to progressivism is perhaps in the casting, where, number one is described as almost mysteriously female, slim and dark in a Nile Valley way. Oh boy.
Oh.
And the navigator is named Jose Ortegas, and he's known as a lover. So at least at first on paper, the sort of diversity we'd be looking for in the future, not quite there.
Yes. Yeah. And again, of course, that's, as you say, I think, what diversity means in a in a meaningful way, in a useful way, is something that is very much an open topic of conversation. And that the extent to which we're talking about diversity or representation on the screen or behind the screen, and diversity of like ideas and ways of looking at diversity and representation, not just not just the optics of it. And I think that you of course see situations where people who probably, to give the benefit of the doubt, like if we say we take for granted that this was well intentioned, if the smaller the pool of people that get to contribute to culture, the more limited their perspective. And so you see someone make the decision to kind of try and go beyond what is currently being done, but they themselves are a part of what's currently being done, and they can only move so far beyond it without getting the perspectives of other people. Things like trying to I would say he easily could have made those casting requirements less diverse than they were. So, but he still was falling into, stereotypes and so giving the benefit of the doubt that he meant well, maybe it sounds harsh to say it's not enough to mean well, but in a social sense, it's not enough for one person to mean well. Like there has to be.
That's true. Yeah. And he needs to be judged, I think, by the times that he lived in and his background and all that sort of thing. It's funny because, the original pitch doc has, on a previous episode of this season, we went through all the pitches in the original Star Trek Gives pitch doc, and they're all, some of them have that sort of, sort of moral question or a theme that they're exploring, but they're mostly like kind of Outer Limitsy or maybe like Twilight Zone knockoff type stories where there's some kind of twist and can you believe that it's this instead of this? And, you wonder how this show progressed to this idea where it's going to hold up these utopian ideals and these egalitarian ideals. And Gene was two things that I can think of. He was, he was flawed. He was a flawed but moral man. Aspirational, even if he fell short of those aspirations. One of my favorite stories about him is that he hated smoking, and he specifically pushed for the characters on Trek to be smoke-free. I mean, this is a 1960s TV show. We could have had smoking in space, and he arranged that no cigarette ads would run over the show. Did Gene smoke? Of course he did. Of course he did. But he hated the idea of it. And B, he was a TV writer through and through. That is that he knew what a good hook was. He knew how to build tension, and he knew audiences needed to feel good, to feel a sense of satisfaction. And I think that meant telling stories that reinforced moral lessons, ones that were liberal in nature but still palatable to a broad audience. And you see that, in other fictions and shows of the time, of course, and even now.
Right. Yeah. It's again, that, part of what's interesting about Star Trek as it exists now is that, you go back to the original series and it's just from such a different era. And so it's easy to, I think I would imagine that a lot of people who are interested in Star Trek, who maybe come to Star Trek through one of the other series, and then end up going back to the original series out of interest in Star Trek. I would imagine there's a lot of people for whom that is one of the only, or maybe the only TV series they've ever watched from that era of television. And, even myself, certainly, like I've been watching reruns of it since I was a kid. But again, that's probably among the older TV shows that I, even then was watching, when in an era when reruns were a thing and you didn't actually seek out every specific thing you wanted to watch. That was probably among the older shows. I haven't consumed much media at all from that time period aside from the original Star Trek. So it is, I think it's an interesting space to be in where there are certain elements of the original series that to a lot of people that's Star Trek, but then to other people that's just 60s television, right? And the like Vaseline on the camera lens, those kinds of things that there presumably there are a lot of people out there for whom that's a weird thing that Star Trek does, when I believe that was not not an unusual thing to be doing at the time. As far
I think Desi Lou really liked to do it, but it was definitely standard. And I often see or hear about younger viewers who go back or even hesitate to go back to TOS because they say like, oh man, it's so racist and sexist. And it really dismays me because it's certainly like you said, like it might be the first thing from the 60s that they've ever watched. I mean, even for the time, it was not racist or sexist. Like it's very progressive even for that time. It might not be as multicultural, or as feminist as modern entertainment is. But I think people shouldn't let that stop them from going back and viewing the original series. And the original series, as it progressed, Gene and the writers of the show did push the envelope on topics like that. There's episodes like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, The Cloudminders, The Kirk Kiss, and Plato's Stepchildren. These are all from season 3, after Gene had mostly checked out of the day-to-day operations of the series. There are anti-war episodes throughout the series, but then there's also some weirdly pro-war episodes throughout the series. And I think, judged as a whole, the original series may have been very radical for the time, but only scratches the surface in terms of the moral ground that the franchise would cover in later installments. And something struck me about TOS when I was watching, I've been watching through it recently. TOS doesn't really involve a lot of the moral navel gazing that you see in later series. Like the Federation, I think, mostly stands in for a idealized 1960s America, with a lot of the issues of the day being smoothed over. Race people are protesting about racism. We don't have racism. And we've got a racially integrated crew. We've got a Russian guy on the bridge. There's no specter of war. Everyone has agreed on an economic system. We don't know what it is, but they've agreed on it, and it seems to work for them.
Yeah, I think again, the way that we're talking about enterprise and sometimes sort of a rough consensus forms, and I think that with Star Trek, something that you see is that a rough consensus has formed that Star Trek in general is utopian fiction, and I think different parts of it are or aren't to different extents, but I think that the idea of utopianism really kind of gets written backwards onto the original series. I think more so from The Next Generation. I think The Next Generation was much more explicitly utopian. Again, not specific about how that utopia works.
Right.
We have no idea how it really functions day to day, but the idea, like being told explicitly there is no money, people work for the betterment of society themselves, that sort of thing tends to kind of get written back onto the original series, I think, where it certainly was generally optimistic, but like you said, kind of optimistic by virtue of being able to sort of sugarcoat or gloss over certain things. It's as you said, I think the Federation, to whatever extent we understand what the Federation actually was in the original series, and again, that's something that all of Star Trek is guilty of to some extent or another.
Yeah.
Not only the original series, but to whatever extent we actually have any clear picture of what it is. As you said, it's just contemporary America, but there are no problems. But again, we don't know why there are no problems. We don't know how those problems were solved. And, that there can be, it's to say, like, don't worry, all the problems will be solved, that's it can be interpreted in different ways. And one of those ways is, don't worry, we don't really have big problems. The problems we have aren't as big as people are telling you they are. Which is not to say everyone would interpret that way, but it can be interpreted that way. But yeah, it is interesting to look at. I as I said, I think that while it's optimistic, I think that its willingness to sort of challenge society or social ills is maybe sort of attributed to it more than we actually see on screen sometimes.
Yeah, the idea of the Federation in the original series seems to be, they're always going to the planets with like old, human colonists who are like, immortal now because of spores or something like that. And everywhere they go, it's just, a replication of, it's that frontier kind of idea. And so, the Federation represents, I guess, idealized American hegemony across the galaxy. And then later series, TNG and going forward, I think it becomes more of that sort of like classical idea of United Nations. We have a cow alien as a president now, like anybody can be in charge, taking different cultures and planets and groups, and they all sort of exist in the Federation.
We know it works, except when it doesn't, I guess. But
except when it doesn't, that's true. Yeah.
Which of course, as an engine for stories, of course, we mostly only focus on how things work when they're not working, as opposed to how they might actually work for real. Certainly in the original series, and I think continuing a bit into The Next Generation and probably Voyager too. Although I think they, I think they maybe smooth the edges off of this bit to some extent, but certainly in the original series, when there's sort of when there is a place in the galaxy where things are not working properly, it's the result of some very specific system that can be removed. There's a giant computer that Kirk can outsmart or something like that. And once that is removed, then presumably that planet of people can just sort of join the Federation and everything is immediately okay. It's
Yeah.
something that, again, I think the Next Generation and Voyager to certain extents were a bit more sort of cautious with that. But again, it's not really this is how we can make a society work, but it's just there is an artificially introduced system that is,
Yeah.
making people think that they're not more similar to each other than they think they are, and we just remove that, and everyone will suddenly get
Right.
along.
Yeah.
Not really acknowledging that people internalize systems, and of course, the people of the Federation have presumably internalized how the systems of the Federation work too, and that they just because they assume that the way the Federation works is better than the way things work elsewhere doesn't necessarily make that true. It might be true, but again, we don't really know because
Yeah.
we haven't seen enough of it.
How do we uplift this week's planet to the galactic standard, which is our standard, the Federation?
Yeah.
Moving forward chronologically, we could touch on Phase 2, but there's really not much to touch on. I mean, it seems for all intents and purposes that Phase 2 was just going to be more TOS, but with a 70s aesthetic instead of a 60s one, maybe a little Star Wars or Battlestar thrown in. A lot of ideas for Phase 2, however, did get forwarded to TNG. And I think it's interesting that both TOS and TNG debuted in decades of great optimism, at least initially, but also decades where activism and liberal thought were a vocal and growing minority.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think it's again, I think it can be easy to sort of, certainly when I look back at when I go back to TNG today, it can be kind of easy to forget how much TNG, at least in the earlier seasons, I think feels kind of like like a moment in amber, kind of the way that the original series does, because it's so clearly from a different era. But the Next Generation can feel more that way to me than I sometimes remember it feeling, as opposed to, say, something like Deep Space Nine. Of course, there are signifiers that it's from a particular time, but for the most part, it's I feel like Trek going forward from that, if you can dig in and find things that reflect what was going on at the time. But I feel like the Next Generation, to me, often feels more like this sort of very specific moment in time, similar to the way the original series does, at least in the earlier seasons, as I said.
Before TOS gets too far in the rearview mirror, I wanted to ask you, have you ever written an essay comparing The Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before, the two pilots of TOS?
Yes, I have.
Oh.
So I did a few essays where I was comparing first episodes of a few of the different series, and yes, I did one where one of the few, I don't know if I've done others where I compared episodes from the same series. Usually I pick episodes from different series just as part of the format, but
Yeah.
yes, in this case I kind of figured really the Cage kind of is its own series. There so much was changed about it going into the original series that yes, so I kind of cheated a little bit there. But
Well, I gotta go look that up. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
yeah, it is. I think it's really interesting to compare and I know the original series was kind of the way that it started. There were some starts and stops. There was the of course, The Cage, the pilot that didn't get made, and then Where No Man Has Gone Before, the pilot that got made but didn't end up being the first episode. And then there's first episode and other episodes that I believe were potentially going to be the pilots, where you can certainly see some visual differences, like the costumes look different, and that, such as I think the Corbomite maneuver, I believe, or Balance of Terror. I might be wrong about that, but those early sort of kind of mission statement episodes of
Yeah.
original series. It's interesting to kind of look at those, and I think the Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before, there there are similarities in that, strangely enough, when we think of again, kind of writing some of these ideas backwards, we tend to think of Star Trek as being so optimistic about the ways in which technological progress and social progress would just kind of go hand in hand, with like automatically one would feed into the other. But both of those are kind of warnings again. I mean, maybe the
Yeah.
Cage is more about technology, Where No Man Has Gone Before is I mean, it's sort of space magic that makes
Yeah.
the humans kind of superhuman. But I think it could be sort of a stand-in for technology, and then in the Cage, the Telosians have become so advanced, but their
Yeah.
advancement has kind of caused their society to stagnate. So it is interesting that that was they had the chance to do a second pilot, something which, as I understand, is very rare, and they still stuck with that. There are a lot of things that changed, but that thematic idea of sort of be careful what you wish for, be careful how advanced you want to
Yeah.
get, is still
Yeah.
present in both.
Yeah, and they're both stories of, like, the dangers of the frontier or exploration, and I think it's interesting that it isn't until the first production episode, the Corbomite Maneuver, that we finally get a story. It's still a story about, like, ooh, scary aliens, but a story about, like, meeting those aliens, and ultimately the ultimate goal being becoming friends with those aliens, establishing a relationship with those aliens. Little Clint Howard at the end there. But yeah, the first two stories are just like, how will man be corrupted, by the outside?
Yeah, and the Corbomite Maneuver is kind of fascinating in that the sort of the way that concludes is kind of bold even for today, where they've just been terrorized for an hour by this alien, and then they believe the alien is in trouble. Of course, as you said, Clint Howard is doing okay. He's just testing them, but they believe he's in trouble, and Kirk kind of lectures the crew like, no, we don't leave people to their fate. We help them no matter what
Yeah.
they've done to us, no matter who they are. That's
Yeah.
that's not who we are. That would be a bold statement today on a TV show. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, no, we don't just kill the bad guys or leave the bad guys to die. Like, we value all life, including theirs. That's would be a strong statement today.
Yeah, a little speechifying, and a lot of tests. Everybody's
Mhm.
always trying to
Yes.
test us, and of course, we see both of those in TNG. I think TNG marks the place, the exact place. I don't know, maybe season 2, season 3, where Trek actually becomes the font of liberal speechifying and navel gazing it has the reputation for. And after the first season, Gene's health was too poor to work day to day, and the show ended up mostly in the hands of Maurice Hurley, the first of a number of caretakers who would carry Gene's vision forward into the future. And Hurley was an interesting figure. He was a very experienced writer and editor, but he's probably the philosophical opposite of Gene. He's been quoted as saying about Gene's vision for Star Trek that Star Trek is, quote, not like any other show because it is one unique vision, and if you agree with Gene Roddenberry's vision for the future, you should be locked up somewhere, end quote. And he goes on to say, quote, it's wacky doodle. That was one of his favorite terms. It's wacky doodle, but it's his wacky doodle. And if you can't deal with that, you can't do the show. There are rules on top of rules on top of rules. Gene sees this Pollyanna-ish view of the future where everything's going to be fine. I don't believe it, but you have to suppress all that and put it aside. You suspend your own feelings and your own beliefs, and you get with his vision or you get rewritten, end quote. Which, first of all, doesn't sound like a very fun place to work, and it wasn't for many early TNG writers, but it's fascinating to me. The respect that he has for the work ethic, I've been hired to do a job, I'm going to do it. That's amazing. But his slavish adherence to his idea of Gene's vision led to the second season of TNG. Roddenberry famously said that the people of the Federation would and could have no conflict with each other, and Hurley would get in fights with the writers over their scripts where he felt that there was too much interpersonal conflict. He got into an argument with Gene himself when Gene supported a writer's script that Hurley felt fell outside of those guidelines. It's like buying a dog to guard your house, but now the dog won't let you in.
Hurley was like disputing Roddenberry's interpretation of his own rules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is like, okay, wow, that's a caretaker. And Hurley quit at the end of season 2, and his friend and a guy he hired, Michael Piller, took the job. And thank God he did, because this is when TNG, I think, becomes the TNG that we know. Piller, who sadly passed away in 2005, seemed like the perfect showrunner for TNG. If you were to go back in time and pick someone to run TNG to ensure for the future that it becomes the phenomenon it is, I think Michael would be the guy. If Michael Piller didn't exist, we'd have to create him. He was a creative guy, but he was a warm, good person, and I think you feel that when TNG is at its best. You feel that in the show. He could also crack the whip, though, and the writing staff, if he wasn't satisfied with the scripts, he would redevelop them. He would add new ideas. And he also, for good or ill, instituted the open door policy for script submissions, which I haven't run the numbers for it. And I think I want to do that for a future show someday. But it may have led to as many mediocre scripts as standout ones, but some of the standouts it did lead to were great shows. And it was probably vital in keeping the mill of content going for this syndicated show, at least until the 90s Trek empire became established.
Yeah, that open submissions policy is such a fascinating thing. Like it seems like, I mean, I suppose at that point, Star Trek already was, a huge, fan phenomenon, a huge, had a huge fan community, but still, it almost sort of the idea that like we welcome input to such an extent that like we welcome your ideas for episodes you would like to write. It's such a fascinating example of of a fictional universe as like a living thing in the real world. And again, as you said, I'm sure it's not actually that the fandom was sort of generating story after story after story that was able to be made into episodes or into strong episodes, but still there's something about that is so such a, again, kind of reflects, as I said, sometimes the extent to which Star Trek is progressive or optimistic or idealistic is sometimes overstated, but that certainly it's like this series to some extent kind of walking its own talk of idealism, if nothing else, and in a way that like you said, is starkly contrasts with the idea of I think Gene Roddenberry's vision is wackadoodle, but also going to sort of like slavishly stick to the idea. Like it just sort of so unidealistic I guess, as you said, maybe an admirable work ethic to some extent, but just on multiple fronts, the opposite of idealism, right? Like this, I think your idealism is stupid, but, I'm also not going to allow anyone to deviate from it because that's my job. Like just so sort of doubly cynical, right? And and the open submission policy just feels like, however it worked functionally, however much effect it had, again, in terms of actual numbers or whatnot, it just feels like the complete opposite of that.
Yeah, I think the ultimately pessimistic way to think about it is, they were screwed like near the end of the second season because of the writer's strike. So they had no scripts and they were really in trouble, which is why we got Shades of Grey. And so maybe they want more scripts and new blood, but like maybe the positive way, the optimistic way to look at it is Piller, having seen the writer's room and seen what they're putting out, just thought maybe we don't have everything we need right here to do what we want to do and to, reach this this vision of the show that we have. Maybe we need more than what we've got. And for good or ill, I think it worked out. TNG under Piller, and then of course Jerry Taylor in the 7th season, I think became what we think of as Trek now, at least a certain generation does in the modern age. A socially liberal, egalitarian, utopian series that stages morality plays, focuses mostly on external societies and civilizations, but sometimes is willing to self-introspect, point out the shortcomings of the Federation, which is now the stand-in for a utopian 80s, where it has ostensibly stood in for a utopian 60s with the original series. But every Garden of Eden needs a serpent, and for many, that comes in the form of Rick Berman. Berman was initially a co-executive producer with former TOS supervising producer Bob Justman. Berman was promoted to executive producer of the show in the 3rd season and remained on as the EP after Gene's death in 91. And it's not just Rick. Rick in this case will stand in for other people of influence, the Paramount higher-ups and executives. It's not all Rick's fault, but Rick has the job, so Rick gets the responsibility. And Rick, like Maury, maybe not to such a letter of the law extent, in his own words, was committed to preserving the legacy of Star Trek that Gene left him. And he wasn't so adherent to the idea of the vision that he would have argued with Roddenberry himself, I don't think. Certainly he helped develop all of the TNG spin-off shows. Morris Hurley would have never greenlit DS9. I'll tell you that right now. That just would not have happened. But it's become clear looking back at the production of TNG as well as DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise that Berman was something of a diluting force on the progressivism of the franchise.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know that. And as you said, I'm sure that there was probably more going on behind the scenes than just him personally. I'm sure that, that there were others, higher up leading things in that direction. But yes, I know that he has become sort of the face of, again, a sort of, I think certainly, kind of looking ahead to Voyager, I think that that can sort of fairly or unfairly be thought of as kind of gets called a dilution of Star Trek. Again, I think there are ways in which that may be fair or not, but I know that is traced to him personally, however fair it may be in real life or not, but that he has kind of become the face of that, the avatar of that, I guess.
Whenever you research TOS, it's funny that like this show that was made 50 years ago, you can find out like the exact day and date that a second draft was turned in, or they have like scans of like the casting list. Like it's been sort of, you've talked about Frozen in Amber before. There's a really good picture of the production of TOS. TNG, was a more expansive production. And so there are a lot of different voices there, and there isn't like any one, sacred timeline account. But you do hear a lot of like anecdotal evidence about like his interference, stories about how, Rick wouldn't let us cast a male actor as Soren in the episode The Outcast, or David Gerald's Blood and Fire, which would have introduced Star Trek's first gay character, made Rick uncomfortable, so we didn't want to do that.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting contrast, and the kind of going back to the idea of taking certain things from certain points in the franchise and kind of back writing to everything. The idea of Star Trek as progressive, when you have the contrast of like actually behind the scenes, like people were actively working to make it maybe less progressive, and like sort of the idealism was being very deliberately sort of the word like sort of tempered, like that, like we get to be idealistic, but only exactly this idealistic and not more idealistic than that. And kind of I'm sure I would imagine given the chance to explain things, you might hear things like, well, audiences might not be ready for this. But, of course, that's the exact same thing that you could say about portraying certain things in the original series, right? That, we couldn't do this on the original series because audiences weren't ready for it. So it's like if, 20 some years later, if you're still saying, well, audiences aren't ready,
when are they going to be ready?
Yeah, exactly. But still calling yourself idealistic, right? It's one thing to say that if you're just, we're just cynically making a TV show. We're just making money. We're just, putting food on everyone's table, and, the audiences want what they want. We're going to give them what they want so everyone can, pay their bills. Like if you're approaching it that way, that's one thing. I still, I still would prefer that people not be quite that cynical, but, that's at least more coherent as a worldview. But there is that tension there that I think can be uncomfortable to look at sometimes as someone who, as people who care a lot about Star Trek, it can be uncomfortable to look at that tension of that there always was, or, often was, this back and forth between, it can be idealistic, but not that idealistic.
Maybe that cynicism explains then the paradox of a situation where you've got a man like Gene an unlikely progressive who seemed to expand his horizons as he got older, leaving the franchise to a bunch of dudes who would seemingly do everything they can to stop its progress because of this phantom audience, as the years go on. Leading, of course, to a series that Berman himself wrote many episodes of, Enterprise, a show that I love, but is much more conservative than earlier Trek efforts. The lack of oversight of a production can lead to an Enterprise, my apologies, often going astray. But the opposite seems to be true of Deep Space Nine as a series. Originally conceived as more or less a star stay in one place with more political tension, as the higher-ups like Berman and Piller had to neglect the show in favor of developing Star Trek Voyager, the creative minds that remained were able to push the boundaries of Trek storytelling, not just in terms of thematic content, but also adding an element of serialization to the series.
Yeah, Deep Space Nine. I mean, of course, I'm biased here. Deep Space Nine is my favorite series of Star Trek, but it really is. I think, as much as I can be objective, I think that Deep Space Nine really is striking for again, for going in such different directions, and kind of like Enterprise. Like it, I think. Again, having it all finished, decades ago now, like it's easy to see Deep Space Nine as because we so often focus on the serialization of it and the fact that it's telling these long, overarching stories. We can kind of maybe lose sight sometimes of the fact that they were kind of trying things and seeing what would stick to the wall too. But I think with a pretty coherent, like a coherent set of sort of like thematic concerns behind it. It starts off more as just sort of, like the outer space version of kind of the like a Wild West town that people are just passing through or something like that, and kind of goes back and forth between focusing more on like Bajoran politics, but then kind of shifting focus somewhat to the Dominion War. And but I think that when you go back and rewatch the series, like you can kind of see, like this series actually was changing a fair bit as it went. I think it all it coheres together because I think there were coherent ideas behind it, or coherent like goals of what they wanted to do, and like what that ended up looking like plot wise might have changed over time. But I think that a lot of what the series seemed to want to do, in sort of the first season, pretty well carries over into what it ended up doing later on, even if the sort of the most obvious focuses of the show changed a bit.
Yeah, they were doing Alan Moraine and things like that in the first season, but they were still doing things. I can't remember the name of it now, but the episode where Kira has to burn Brian Keith out of his home because he's settling on the moon or whatever. Like they're in Duet, they're already like digging deep into their premise. I mean, I have almost no notes, from a black captain to a diverse crew, tackling every theme under the sun, essentially, including actual economic disparity, depicting war and the pew-pew as maybe not actually being all that great, and war's effects on people, and fascism and populism, creationism. Like DS9 hits every branch on the way down for the most part.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think I think Deep Space Nine is where we finally see, again, some of the unwillingness to kind of dig deeper into the causes of social ills in the original series, and to some extent in the Next Generation. I think Deep Space Nine is where we actually see, if we visit a planet and there's a bad computer there running everyone's lives, and we get rid of the computer and now everyone's fine. That basically has no concept of history, right? Maybe the computer's been in charge for 500 years or whatever, but the computer's gone now, so everything's fine. But of course, that's not how it works. If the computer's been there for 500 years, that's 500 years of history to deal with. And Deep Space Nine, I think, is the first time that I shouldn't say the first time. Like I think the Next Generation was working its way toward this, and may have. I think that the Next Generation kind of did this a bit through the Klingon Empire, probably, and sort of like in microcosms of like family, like Worf's family story, and those kinds of things. That family is a form of history, of course, right? That's a way of dealing in a microcosm with the concept of history, of how we are all products of history. We're literally the product of our families, but we're also the products of their history too, not just their genetics, but their their what happened to them and what they believed. And and then Deep Space Nine kind of dispenses with the more allegorical way of doing that, and actually just says like, no, we have Bajor, which is a place that is coming out of a long and brutal and horrifying military occupation that people are going to be dealing with the effects of for a long time to come. And the Cardassians are that you mentioned Duet, and the Cardassians have a journey to go on to come to terms with the fact that like our society did a horrific thing, an absolutely nightmarish thing. And no, we didn't. We, the Bajorans are making it all up, and and someone comes along and says, well, no, like it's not only about them. Like we should admit what we did for the Bajorans' sake, but we should also admit it for our own sake, because we can't grow if it's not good for us either to pretend that history doesn't exist. So I think Deep Space Nine, was the first time you really saw that wrestled with in Star Trek, I think, really seriously.
Yeah, all that doesn't exist when you just talk the computer to death and you fly away and never come back.
Exactly.
there is no history to examine.
Yeah.
Then there's Star Trek Voyager, and I don't really know what to say about Star Trek Voyager. I mean, obviously there should be a lot to say. 7 seasons of a show that featured just kind of more of the same. The diverse cast, examining issues. It feels like, if I had to be really reductive of Voyager, it feels like an attempt to do TNG again, but to try and maintain a very complicated premise. Often those two things, I think, were at odds with each other. I think in an ideal world, Voyager would have got home at the end of season 3, and then we could have just done something else, just, followed, maybe synthesized TNG and DS9, and then having some going boldly and some sticking around and just growing those characters. But as it is, like, it just feels like a show that's always fighting against the idea that they're stranded. They are a tiny island of the Federation in the Delta Quadrant, and mostly just kind of just random plots, things that we haven't covered in other shows.
Yes, yeah, I find that going chronologically, I find that Voyager and Enterprise are where I start to have a harder time, picking at what those series are, what the sort of larger themes of the series are. But in Voyager's case, I think they certainly had themes in mind, and they had their premise. The original premise of the show is really actually well geared towards kind of continuing to do, to dig a little deeper into, Deep Space Nine's willingness to question, what would a better future look like, and what's the messy business of getting there, and how do you deal with, the past and all that kind of thing. Voyager could have, its premise suggested that it was going to kind of ask, like, well, what is good about the Federation? Like, how far, literally, how far can we get from the Federation and still be the Federation? But also in, philosophically, or in terms of the way we run things day to day, what makes us Federation? What is worth hanging on to of being a part of the Federation when you are, literally on the other side of the galaxy from it. But I think that it's, I think sometimes I wonder if I'm too harsh on Voyager, because sometimes I think I'll think of it as, well, Voyager just kind of abandoned that, which is a shame. I wish they hadn't abandoned that. But then I think, well, actually, some of my favorite episodes going through, like, all the way through the run of the series, some of my favorite episodes of it actually are episodes that do deal with that. The Void of I believe that's the Void, where they're in a pocket of space with other species that are trapped there as well, and Janeway just forms a mini federation to help get everyone out. And of course, Equinox, which is like so on the nose, but I still appreciated the idea if they run into a Voyager that didn't fare as well as they did, and a ship that's sort of the Equinox is sort of a stand-in for Voyager if Voyager had a much rougher time of things in the Delta Quadrant and had decided to sacrifice elements of the philosophy of the Federation and decided to do what needed doing, not just what you do when you're in Starfleet. So like on an episode, on a single episode level, I think they did come back to that idea of how do we use this premise to examine like what it means to be, a utopian society and that sort of thing. But they kind of abandoned it on a macro level, I guess. And yeah, again, just kind of ended up visiting planets and solving problems, much like in other Star Trek. I watched Worst Case Scenario the other day. There's a holodeck recreation of what it might be like if the Maquis rebelled, and there's a lot interesting in that, where there a lot of meta stuff in that, where they're so dismissive of the fact that like, oh, imagine if the Maquis had actually rebelled, being stuck on a ship with the people they were rebelling against when we caught them, and of course it's like, well, no, that would have been really interesting. I kind of wish you had to. And so like I like and hate Worst Case Scenario, because it is kind of like, oh, well, you're just teasing me now. But they also, the holographic Chakotay, when he rebels, when he takes over the ship, says something like, we're not going to stop and investigate every anomaly on our way home.
Yeah, right.
Again, just very much hanging a lantern on exactly what the writers of Voyager have realized that they've done, is they've taken this starship to the other side of the galaxy, and then in a lot of episodes at least have just somewhat created the Next Generation.
Yeah. In comparing DS9 to Voyager, I think it's a lesson on how premise is not always as important as setting. There's a solid premise to Voyager that they're going to be trying to get home over the course of however many years. And sure, it's set in the Delta Quadrant, but it's always changing. And the backdrop of Bajoran space and Bajor and Cardassia and the wormhole, and even the Gamma Quadrant, is such an interesting setting, an interesting playground for drama, that I think DS9 really shines above Voyager in that respect.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that whether intentionally or not, I think the crew of Deep Space Nine made a really good choice by just forcing their own hand and setting it on a space station, right?
Yeah,
so it's like they gave themselves ships later on and whatnot, but they gave themselves the Defiant, but still, like they're like, no, like we're committed to this, like we're on a space station. Whereas when you set the show on a ship, that ship can go anywhere and do anything, but that also means you could just go back to doing what you did before too. Yeah. Whereas the station, it's like you said, the setting kind of not determined everything, but the setting really, forced them to examine some new ideas. Well, still, of course, Deep Space Nine still did its, anomaly of the week episodes too, but
yeah. It's interesting too how the zeitgeist, or just the way that where the place that society is at when these shows come out influences not only how they're created, but how they're received. And I wonder if at that time, the late 90s, early 2000s, if that was just the right premise or the right, just the right milieu for a show to have. The 60s, there's this idea of still American exceptionalism and exploration, and I think that you could even fit that into the 80s. In the 90s, we sort of slow down and we're caught in a war or two that we don't want to be in. We maybe see that reflected in DS9, and I'm not sure that Voyager, going back to that just sort of adventure, exploring, meeting places, finding new computers to talk to death, if that was really where the show needed to be. And, Enterprise as a series was was such a reaction to 9/11 that it barely matters that it was conceived and the first season was half shot before 9/11 even happened. I mean, you can see there was something in the water, something in the air. You can see how quickly the show in the back half of season 1 pivots to keep up with current events. But I think there was just something already there to create a prequel show that, as we said before, was so human-centric and I hesitate to say jingoistic, but it was certainly that era was there.
Yeah, I do that. Yeah, that's a really good point. I wonder what if to do that project of a prequel that shows us that has the opportunity at least to actually show us like how do we get to a better future, whether it's utopian or just optimistic or whatnot. What does that process look like? We've seen breadcrumbs of the fascinating sort of future history that that the original series first started with Space Seed, I think, with Khan, and the idea that and then the Next Generation gives us the idea of the post-atomic horror, that there's this between us, whenever we're watching this, and the future of Star Trek. There's all this, I think really, to my mind, one of the smartest things Star Trek ever did, introducing that idea of it's not all progress one way. It's not all inevitable progress. There's going to be a lot of trouble on the way too. If you were to take that project of like, how do we get from things actually being worse than they are now to things getting better, and take everything back to basics, like sort of very early warp flight and those kinds of things. If that were made in a different era, I wonder how it would be different, because again, the idea of like, here's a rougher version of humanity, a rougher around the edges, less, a bit less optimistic, less, sort of progressed, version of humanity. To do that, in the wake of 9/11, and all the jingoism of that followed that, is just kind of unfortunate, I think. Which again, not to say that I think some really good stuff came out of Enterprise, but it is kind of, oh no, like this is maybe an unfortunate era to be trying to do that. It did give them the chance to comment, but yeah, it would be interesting to see what that would look like if it were done at another time. But
it really would, yeah. And maybe as something that is supposed to be, the whole premise is that it's showing the infancy of humanity, at least galactic humanity, humanity in the Star Trek universe. Maybe it couldn't have been made at any other time. Maybe it needed to be made at that time, warts and all, to capture just writers at that time's what their idea was of what we would look like. Not quite perfect, not quite the humanity that we see later on in Star Trek. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, it is.
It could have been worse. It could have been way worse. Is what I'm saying.
Yes. Oh, for sure. It definitely could have been worse, for sure. Yeah, and it is kind of interesting to have this, just this sort of cultural document of like, this is people trying to make Star Trek after 9/11, immediately after 9/11, and that, it's kind of interesting to see that the working through of, it's interesting to see that.
I think maybe for that reason, I wouldn't trade it. I think maybe I'd keep it exactly the way it was. Who knows? Or give it 7 seasons and have the second half of the show have them evolve even more into what we'd like to see from our Trek. We can talk CBS Trek, certainly the first season of Discovery, but I'm not too concerned about including CBS shows in this particular conversation. Not because they're not worthy, just because they're still in the process of becoming. They're writing their own legacy, and we're not able to look back on them in the same way. I do think it's significant that whatever the individual storylines or the themes they're exploring on Disco, the commitment to multiculturalism and not just ethnic diversity is near total. You've got a black female protagonist that was in the cards from day one, from what I understand. You've got a diverse crew, LGBTQ actors and characters, trans and non-binary actors, characters. In universe, they're all treated equally. They're all exist in positions of authority. They even have a robot lady. They've got everything.
Right.
Which is really like, as we established at the beginning of the show, Gene's like baseline level of what he wanted to accomplish on the show was like getting more faces of color on TV.
Right. Yeah. No. I think that definitely like Discovery is interesting in that. Yeah. It kind of just taking that idea of like this, we're going to take what was said should be done, and maybe audiences weren't ready for it yet, and we're just going to do it, making, maybe missteps here and there along the way, or, doing things imperfectly, but everything's imperfect again. It can be good for things to be handled imperfectly if it means they're being acknowledged, at least.
Yeah, certainly. And like we said, like the book isn't written yet on some of the new shows, but I do think it has been imperfect so far. I'm not sure what the show's real voice is at this point, outside of just a 21st century multicultural liberalism. You can try to push collectivism like in season 3 of Discovery, but in season 1 you were talking about Elon Musk, and so I think there's definitely room to grow for the franchise still.
Right. Yeah, and I think as you had mentioned that an interesting thing about Enterprise is where you see the sort of the production value, that Enterprise was the first place you kind of see the production values on TV at least catch up to some of the concepts, or catch up to that extent. Not that they were doing a bad job at any, given what they had to work with, but yeah, of course, that carries through greatly to Discovery. But going along with that, you do have the sense of this show is a big deal. This show is a big investment. This show is a massive workplace that's paying a lot of people's mortgages and whatnot. And like, there's a lot of there's a lot of I'm sure like trying to make a good product, but not always, there being sort of different visions of how that's going to work, and people trying to tell good stories within that, but also being different visions of how that's going to work. And I do think sometimes there are some very interesting story ideas or interesting thematic things that kind of do feel like they get a little lost in the shuffle, or a little rushed, and things can a thing that was a good thing to attempt to do can end up feeling like it maybe wasn't given the attention it deserved, not necessarily because of the writing that went into it, but maybe because of just the wrangling of how do we get this whole massive machine to where we want it to be.
Plus, I feel like there is a huge connection in continuity, or exploiting the existing setting of Trek. But I feel like, other than just sort of the general kind of themes that Trek usually approaches, I don't feel like the new shows have, maybe Picard is an exception, but like have too much tried to update Trek's statements on certain themes. We all kind of roll our eyes when the TOS does the naked time, and then TNG's like, oh, we'll do the naked now. It feels a little cheap. But a lot of times, Trek is, if not explicitly revisiting locations or redoing plots, is giving, the sort of modern take or look at certain things. And I mean, it does it some, otherwise you'd have nothing to write about.
Right.
But I kind of wish that they would specifically look back at earlier questions asked and answered, and kind of, even though they're set in an earlier time or set at a later time, give the CBS Trek sort of answers to those questions.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think of course that sort of that iterative nature of Star Trek, where here's this kind of a story, and then here's this kind of a story told the same kind of a story but told a slightly different way. As you said, like, it can be easy to sort of pick at that, and maybe call it unoriginal. I think calling a work of fiction unoriginal is not a very interesting thing to say about it in general. But it's easy to pick at that iterative nature. But I agree that that's part of what is interesting about Star Trek, to me at least, as like a body of work, is that you do see all of these, a lot of ideas being returned to and approached in slightly different ways. And I mean, we were talking about Voyager before, but and also talking before about how sometimes there's a push and pull between sort of liberalism and conservatism in Star Trek to a greater extent than we sometimes acknowledge. I think Voyager, for instance, I think of author, where they to some extent return to The Measure of a Man from The Next Generation, where the measure of a man is Data's rights as an android are being put on trial, and author, the doctor, the EMH's rights as a holographic author are being hammered out in a court. And it's striking to me how Voyager actually says something very different than The Next Generation did there. Like, the Voyager kind of comes down on the side of more like the doctor's coworkers say, well, yeah, you have your rights, but you don't need to go as making us feel all, uncomfortable about it. We're nice people, right? We're not holding you down. So therefore, no one is holding you down.
Right.
And, saying like, well, the judge reaches the exact opposite, or, whatever his title would be, but he reaches the exact opposite conclusion as in The Measure of a Man, where The Measure of a Man, it's we need to be proactive about this and decide whether Data has rights or not, because it's gonna be an issue. And in author, they're like, well, we can't decide this right now. We have to just sort of let's let time tell if it's right to deny him his rights or not. And so given that, like, I think it kind of would be interesting. What if we and they may be in some ways, in some like thematic ways and stuff, maybe have revisited some of those concepts. But if they were to do more, if the CBS Star Trek was to do more of like an iteration on that, okay, let's do our version of The Measure of a Man and author, and maybe say something kind of specific about like, where do we fall now? What is Star Trek's perspective on this now? Which I think sometimes the overarching plots of seasons kind of maybe obscure those more sort of specific positions a little bit.
Yeah. And for a franchise with a reputation for trying to ask or solve these questions, I think it's funny that Measure of a Man and author, both those cases are really cases of property law in a lot of ways. They aren't really even making a decision about sentience and life. And specifically in Measure of a Man, the judge says, I can't make that decision like for you. All we're doing is deciding whether Starfleet owns Data, and then an author deciding whether the doctor, who isn't really recognized as a being, can own his own work. And so, for a post-scarcity communist space country, the fact that they're still having these arguments about law and property, I find that very fascinating. That leads into my last question for you as we wrap up here. We've talked about how Trek has grown and changed, and we've talked about how it specifically has seemed to wrestle with its egalitarian aspects, with its military aspects, its conservatism versus liberalism. It was invented in the 60s, certainly a time of social change, but almost 60 years ago now at this point. Do you think that Trek is enough of an open-ended premise or setting to be flexible enough to speak to the issues of today going forward?
That's a really good question. That is something I have been thinking about a lot. After the last couple of years,
Yeah.
it is it has at times been kind of strange to rewatch episodes of Star Trek, to watch the new Star. Even during the pandemic, we had a lot of Star Trek come out, at various points, and just to watch that and to think about it at this particular time, and it's kind of hard to ignore how much sort of resistance there is in the sort of wider culture to change. I think I used to think the idea that Star Trek wise, like we eventually would that we would want as a society, as a species, to reach a point where everyone's everyone has value and everyone gets to just live. They don't have to afford to live, they just get to live. I think I wasn't always naive enough to think that would actually happen, but I was naive enough to think that most people want that, even if they conceptualize how to get there differently, that most people want it. But it is kind of hard to ignore how the extent to which that idea is actually seems pretty controversial at the moment.
Yeah, it's an attack. Yeah.
But I think in general terms, I think that depending on what's done with it, I think Star Trek is, again, it can be a vehicle for so many different kinds of ideas that I would like to think that it could deal with that. Again, I think, as you've talked about on other episodes of the show, I think the most recent seasons of Discovery and Picard both kind of don't really give a lot of hope in that direction, and that they both kind of just end with just the Federation reasserting itself and no real questions being asked about should it, what's good about it, why like Riker rides to the rescue with a fleet of identical starships, and the Federation are the good guys. Don't worry about the fact that they didn't really help as much as they could have during the Romulan crisis. They're the good guys. And similarly in Discovery, the Federation is expanding its influence again. That's a good thing. Why? We don't really see a lot of what they're doing, but yeah, it's a good thing. So that makes me a little I would like to I'm interested to see what Lower Decks does in that regard. I think it's the most sort of thematically coherent of the new Trek series, in my opinion. And I kind of thinking about say the directions that the creator of that show has maybe taken Rick and Morty and things like that. It would be kind of I'm curious to see how far that show will go, whether they will sort of push boundaries of what exactly is the Federation and how good is the Federation exactly. Maybe they won't. I don't. But I am generally hopeful that Star Trek can maybe get a bit more introspective about how are we defining a good future, because I think it's really important that we be doing that right now. And I think Star Trek is it has sort of the raw materials to do that, I think. Or at least some of the raw materials. We have ideas of like, what does it look like to what does a better version of humanity look like in terms of, sort of smaller things? Like Star Trek can give us some examples of that. So I'm hopeful that it could maybe look at a bit more of a macro level and actually sort of be maybe a bit more controversial and say, well, what specifically could we do to make society better? But yeah.
I think proposing a challenge, a serious challenge to the presumption of the benevolence of authority, is the new final frontier for Trek.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
We'll see if any of the new shows take up that banner. But Peter, this has been great. I can have these kinds of expansive discussions about Trek all day. But for now, I would definitely tell the audience that if they're interested in similar ruminations about where Trek is going in comparison to where it's been, they could do a lot worse than to go to trekversustrek.com and read some of your excellent essays. Where else can people find you online?
At the moment, trekversustrek.com. I haven't, it's been a while since I've updated with new essays, but I'm hoping to have more soon. You can follow me on Twitter as well at Trek versus Trek, just all the words with no spaces. I also have a personal blog that I haven't been updating that much lately, but if you want to find it, it's just my full name, peteraidanbyrne.com.
All right. Well, once again, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for talking with me today.
It's been great.